Welcome to Impact TV, a corporate venture video series in collaboration with the Kaufman Fellows. I'm Jack Crawford, a founding managing partner at Saracap Impact Venture Capital, and alongside my colleague, Pat Bumpus, and my Kaufman Fellow co-chair, Alessandro Santo, we're thrilled to welcome to the show Josh Belicki, a principal at Nationwide Ventures. Josh, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you so much for the time. Pleasure to be a part of this and you know, share a little bit about the CVC world. And it sounds like you've got a growing universe of these episodes for all folks to learn.
So, all right, be honest with us. Are you a little sleep deprived? I understand you have a new baby in the family, and I remember I've got three kids myself, and those early days were pretty tough. Trying to figure out how to balance work and sleep and all that stuff. How are you doing? You hanging in there?
Hanging in there, it feels like I'm getting a bit more founder empathy. It's one of those things we're kind of, building the plane as we're flying it, learning as we're going, making a lot of mistakes, but keeping everyone alive. So far so good. We're having fun, and a lot of credit to my wife, who's really keeping everything together.
Yeah, that's the same thing at our house. So she did everything, and I just felt like a support system. And for a while, the kids just felt like a third arm on her body. I was like, hey, when do I get to be a dad? But we figured that out over time. Okay, so let's talk about your professional journey. We've done about 50 of these episodes on Impact TV. A number of different people have gone from kind of investment banking into venture, and you went from investment banking into corporate venture. Can you just talk a little bit about the investment banking experience and maybe how it influenced investment decisions or process or portfolio management?
Yeah. I think it has influence in a couple of different ways. Some of which I think are quite beneficial, and others I think are kind of, exercises in unlearning some of the things that you've learned in banking. But, ultimately, I think, where the benefits come from are you see all these different business models across the various life cycles, whether it's, kind of mid to late stage capital raising, obviously exiting through M&A or IPOs. But at the end of the day, I think what's most beneficial is, you live and breathe financial modeling for years on end. And at the end of the day, that's kind of the language of how, the business kind of is the output, right? So you understand what the assumptions are, which drive the business, which drive the revenue, and then therefore the output and the, EBITDA. So in this case, kind of retracting it slightly, when you're looking at the models of the founders, I mean, look, all these models are going to take you left, right, up, down, not necessarily, going to be correct, but it helps you understand how they think and where they're going and how they think they're going to get there. And to me, kind of unpacking how they think is really important is a part of kind of the DNA of the business and where it's going to go and how you can kind of partner with that founder and kind of help them get to that place. So I think, the investment banking background is really helpful kind of influencing that. But I do think some of the unlearnings are, these are very immature businesses and you have to treat them as such. And, you can't necessarily hold them to the fire if they're going to miss, quarterly growth. It's just not how it works in this world. But it's been an interesting thing that it certainly has influenced how I've looked at businesses and interacted with founders.
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective. That's interesting because it's more than just being a spreadsheet jockey applied to startups. You're really talking about the team elements. So yeah, that's valuable. Okay, so Nationwide Ventures. Most people are familiar with Nationwide, but why don't you just sort of at the 40,000 foot level,
Sure.
who is Nationwide? Let's just start at the sort of the corporate level, the mothership level, and then maybe tell us a little bit about how Nationwide Ventures is sort of partnering and investing with startups.
Absolutely. So Nationwide is, top 10 insurance carrier in the US. We're slightly different than some of the other large names that you're probably familiar with. You've seen commercials for, in the fact that we're kind of a diversified platform. And, what that means is, we have the P&C side of the house, which is, what you're seeing commercials for, home, auto, commercial, all things like that. But in addition to that, and you'll probably have seen some of the Peyton Manning commercials about Nationwide Financial, they don't necessarily reveal what products that we have on that side of the house, but that side includes life insurance, annuities, retirement solutions, all the type of kind of wealth preservation elements that kind of come with, you're protecting your home and auto with insurance, and on the other side, you're protecting and preserving kind of your life and wealth over time. So we have kind of both sides of the equation, which can be somewhat rare in the world of insurance, where folks have kind of specialized on one side of the house or the other. But that is who Nationwide is and how it kind of informs how we think about the world and the types of investments we want to make. But I'll kind of pause there on kind of who Nationwide is. We're headquartered in Columbus, Ohio, with offices in New York, Des Moines, Scottsdale, and a couple other locations. But that's kind of who Nationwide is at core.
And then sort of let's piggyback comments around how is Nationwide Ventures sort of partnering and investing in startups to sort of support what is a very large organization, large company working on a lot of different sort of industry sectors and initiatives for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I would say that we're a medium-sized team. So there's 8 of us on the team, and the breakdown is about split half of the folks focusing on P&C, which is kind of where I live, and then the other four focusing a little bit more on NF or nationwide financial. So that kind of helps us at least narrow the breadth of what we're focusing on and helps us get a little bit deeper on the various kind of topic areas that we're focused on. So, how we end up serving nationwide across the two kind of larger organizations is, it's a combination of individual relationships, particularly those folks that, have worked in CVC understand that, this is extracurricular work for the, business employees to look at startups, to consider new technologies, to keep up with trends, to run POCs, to run, a process with, a number of different vendors that maybe we're bringing to the forefront. So, it's about finding the right champions who are interested in this type of work. And we're always extraordinarily happy when we find them. But B, there's also kind of more organized quarterly type updates that we'll have with, business leaders across particular verticals, whether it's mobility, as we're thinking about, PLCL auto. It certainly could be on the life and annuity side. It can be on the cyber side, actuarial. So, ultimately we like to have some type of structured, I wouldn't call it reporting, but let's say, lifting up, information or bubbling up, trends that we're seeing, companies that are interesting, founders that we'll bring in and have them speak directly to these leaders so they can just see and hear what we're seeing and hearing, and ultimately can flag what's important or interesting to them and, how they're thinking about the next, 12, 24, 36 months and allow us to marry what we're seeing in the market with maybe what they're thinking about into the future and trying to bring those two things together.
And this is Nationwide Ventures interacting with the various business units to understand kind of the areas of interest as it relates to mobility or cybersecurity, or I know some of the other areas that you're focused on, enterprise infrastructure and property tech and the future of work. Is that right? You're sort of, that's the way in which you collaborate with the business units?
Yes, that's one of the key ways that we do it.
It's super helpful because you may know our strategy is creating from a venture perspective is looking at building a corporate intelligence platform by doing interviews like the one you and I are doing now and understanding sort of what are your areas of interest by industry sector, by stage, so that we end up elevating our investing IQ as a seed and early stage investor and then bringing you more industry relevant deal flow. So at the end of the day, that's how we're thinking about things. We're obviously spending a lot of time talking about how AI effectively is applied to security or finance or digital health or some of these other areas. How are you finding that sort of AI is sort of shaping your view on the investment themes that you mentioned?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I would say one of the kind of retorts people have about insurance is, well, I guess broadly speaking, FIs, if banking is 10 years behind the curve in technology, insurance is 10 years behind banking. So we tend to be laggards as it pertains to technology adoption, but I think that's for a couple of good reasons. I mean, one, it's a highly regulated market. So, AI, at least historically, as you kind of think about the black boxes of neural networking and machine learning, it was something that really couldn't even be applicable in some circumstances where you're applying to the DOI for a new insurance product and you have to, in clear terms, explain how it works. And if it's AI is deriving XYZ price, it's simply not going to be allowable within the Department of Insurance for admitted solutions. So on one hand, we're going to be a little bit behind from a regulatory perspective, one way or the other, just as we kind of get up the curve there. But I do think there's a tremendous excitement and energy around it as well. Nationwide had a press release within the last couple of months talking about, $1 billion+ budget that will be applied to AI projects, across the organization, whether it's, individual workflows, automations across various lines of business, contemplations and POCs of workbenches across underwriting, claims, first notice of loss, all these different ways that insurance can be sped up and ultimately can be more beneficial for the policyholders themselves. Because at the end of the day, unfortunately, insurance is also kind of infamous for low NPS, because the only time you're ever interacting with your insurer is when something goes wrong. So you're already a little upset before you get on the phone. But we think that AI potentially could help bridge the gap by improving customer service, improving how we're able to underwrite in the first place, and deliver a better experience for everyone, whether it's a personal line, a commercial line, or a wealth product on the other side of the fence. So it's certainly something that we're spending a lot of time on, like I said, with that press release in particular. But as you think about the venture team as well, we're certainly looking at point solutions, as small as AI assisted filing for new insurance products, to things that are more broad. Like I was saying with underwriting workbench, how do we think about automating and expediting underwriting so we can get, essentially more policies, bound and shipped. So it's definitely an enterprise-wide uh, mindset that we're working on. And every day it's kind of a new journey as to what are the new tools, how are we using them, how are we going kind of top down. And I'd like to think that Nationwide Ventures is part of the spearhead as we're thinking about the tools that are out there and how we're using them and how we're helping stand up POCs across the organization. So it's certainly exciting. It's exciting for Nationwide.
Extremely helpful feedback and market insight. I think we have some portfolio companies that may be relevant to you, so I'll have a sidebar with you at some point and talk about some of those
Love
portfolio
it.
companies. But thanks for that market insight. That's really helpful. As people sort of learn more about what's happening in the insurance industry and look at the sort of the macro elements that might impact your industry sector focus. I'm curious, is weather an issue? Are natural disasters across the country, around the world, an issue? Or is wartime an issue? Are there some macro factors that sort of directly influence sort of your thinking about where to invest and how best to support the corporate that you work for?
Sure. No, absolutely. And I think weather is certainly a macro that is something we're thinking about all the time. Even on a personal level, Indiana, which is of course, south of Ohio, is having tornadoes. That wind came up, it literally ripped a window off of my house. And a squirrel got into our house, almost Christmas vacation style. This happened a couple of days ago. But then the first thing is, okay, do I call my insurer? How do I handle this? What is this weather doing that's impacting, kind of my day-to-day life? And so, one of the theses that I spent time on with some of my colleagues was understanding and thinking more deeply about the impact of wildfire on the ability to insure, whether that's, on the West Coast or as it's kind of moving more inland, as we've all seen how those trade or essentially how these trends are moving. So, for Nationwide, where, it's top of mind to protect kind of assets, lives, and livelihoods, how do we best do that? And in the case of a wildfire or just, extreme weather kind of writ large, we like to think of it almost kind of as a mosaic of things. It's not going to be better underwriting individually. It's not going to be better, geographic positioning or risk dispersion over an area. It's a combination of new technologies that are going to help you better underwrite. It's probably a manifestation of physical reinforcements, things that can help potentially reduce premium with in partnership with your insurance. And other crazier technologies, like a company that we haven't invested in, but I do think is really wild and interesting, a company called BurnBot, which is based out of California, which essentially is helping reinforce the health of forests around communities and minimizing available fuel for wildfires to not only ignite but to grow and spread. So there's all types of things, both physical and on the technology layer, that are helping mitigate some of these things and helping insurers better serve policyholders and increase their security on their livelihood and their assets. So it's a very important topic and it's very top of mind within Nationwide, no doubt about it.
So we talked a little bit about industry sectors. Maybe you could just talk about stage and typical check size that you're targeting.
Yeah. So we've got about 40 portfolio companies today. We were founded back in 2016, so it's been about a decade. And so, averaging about four investments a year or so. And I would say if you look at the histogram of our 40 investments, A would historically be where we primarily have gotten involved. But I would say we've started to do more on the seed level as well. It's just, I think the maturity of the market, what a seed is today, an A might have been 5 years ago. Right. So as you kind of think about where we position, I'd say seed through B is kind of where our sweet spot is. I will say we don't issue terms, we don't lead, and we don't take board seats. So think of us as your co-investor of choice. We're not here to be a sharp elbow that's going to take a deal from you or take the cap table space. I would say think of us when you're looking for a strategic partner within insurance or within financial services that you think can be beneficial to the business, or we can be, or the flip side, the business or the business can be beneficial to Nationwide. And so, from a check perspective, on the seed level, think of us as 500,000 to 1.5 million. At the A, 2 to 3, and at the B and beyond, we can go to 5 to 20. So we can be flexible in being, a meaningful capital partner throughout the life cycle of businesses. But I would say, A to B is definitely where we like to spend our time. It would be an outlier for us to do a CED pre-IPO type round.
And then how do you communicate value to the syndicate that you're participating in or to the founder as it relates to your ability to add value beyond capital? What we're seeing is a lot of corporates are embracing pilot projects with startups. Some of them are launching accelerators. Some are making curated introductions or working on co-development efforts, providing channel support, access to customers. Is there any? I mean, there's a little bit of a industry validation if Nationwide gets involved in a company that certainly supports the credibility of that startup, but as a brand, because you got such a credible brand. Other things that you're sort of typically focused on when you think about adding value beyond capital?
Yeah. So I'll answer it in two ways. So I guess I'll first answer the kind of flavors of how we can be helpful, and then I'll kind of move on to how do we typically see ourselves being helpful as it pertains to, investment rounds before or after. So, many times I typically like to ask the founder, how would you like to work with Nationwide? And, from there, then it's my job to shepherd them, through the tens of thousands of employees that is Nationwide, because it can be a very, complex and large organization, and knowing the right person, it can make all the difference. But, inevitably what that looks like is maybe it's distribution through our networks. It could be co-product creation. If you are an insurance-oriented, MGA or full stack carrier, it could look like a capacity relationship. We could stand up a front or a captive. Anything kind of within the technical insurance world, we have the capabilities to help startups do. But in addition to that, it's of course access to our kind of broad networks across the other large carriers, which can have certainly turn into customer relationships, as well as access to the SMEs that are across all the different lines of business, because we cover essentially every single type of insurance outside of health insurance. So whatever they're looking for, we probably have an expert, if not many. And then lastly, of course, the customer relationship, which, for most startups is maybe what they're always seeking, or the ideal outcome. And that's something that we absolutely try to angle for every single time whenever we're making an investment. And, as it pertains to kind of how we're adding that value, I think, you ask a great question, because a lot of CVCs, can sometimes, or I think CVC writ large can have a negative connotation and reputation, which is unfortunate because I think when done right, CVC is one of the most powerful forms of capital. And how we try to add value is, candidly, in my opinion, it's best when we get to know a company at least a year ahead of their next capital raise, because it gives me time to get to know the business, get to know the founder, understand, how could we potentially work with this person? Do we want to work with this person? Having several interactions, not just one dot, but several dots to become a line. And ultimately, that gives me an opportunity to socialize them across a variety of individuals in the business, different lines of business, see where real opportunity is starting to emerge. Because at the end of the day, as I'm sure you know from all of these CVC interviews that you've done, I mean the sales cycle with large enterprises tends to be long. The sales cycle within FIs in particular is extraordinarily long. And I tried to be very candid and forthright, saying post investment we're looking at 12 to 36 months for something to like truly occur. A POC may happen between that, but a POC to a contract is a whole nother gulf that you need to get over. So ultimately for us, in a perfect world, I'm getting to know them 6 to 12 months in advance. We're socializing them across the business. They're seeing where they could potentially have, a customer relationship or other types of relationships. And, then we're both invigorated together. It's a mutual interest in wanting to do something and knowing and being forthright that it's going to take time, but we're excited because, businesses, startups take 10, 15, 20 years to really come to fruition. So, waiting 2 years out of 20 is, maybe not so long after all.
What percentage of the investments that you make actually end up having a commercial deal as well as the investment?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say, at investment, 100% of the opportunities have some strategic angle as we do them. And then from there, maybe 30% never actually get there. 30% may run through a POC or initial contract and then kind of spin off in some way. And then 30% will engage in a longer term relationship that is lasting, and whether it's a customer relationship, capacity, distribution, et cetera, but it's an ongoing multi-year relationship.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we've seen, geez, anywhere from not much of any commercial relationship. It's just an independent corporate investment arm operating more like a VC to some groups. I think it was Northrop Grumman. 80% of the investments they make come with a side-by-side commercial agreement. Do you have a business unit sponsorship required as you make investments, or are you operating more independently?
I wouldn't call it a sponsorship. It's not as black and white as that. It's, typically, we've developed relationships across the various lines of business, and we can say, XYZ, and I have had a handful of conversations. We've, introduced the company to them. There's legitimate interest in potentially chasing something down here, knowing that it's not going to happen in, tomorrow. But as we're underwriting, we typically try to find at least one, if not two or three opportunities that are strategic. The more shots on goal, the better, as you can imagine, right? It's just a probability game. So anytime we're considering it, we don't necessarily have a corporate champion or sponsor who's going to come to IC and talk about it. It's more so just documented that we have had those conversations, and we believe that there's something to be done.
You mentioned that you're almost always or always following a lead investment from someone else. Is it? I'm envisioning most of the time that's a traditional financial focused VC, or are you finding yourselves more and more following the lead investment of a CVC?
It's a great question. We've definitely done both, but I would say by and large, it's typically a traditional institutional VC that's setting the terms. And one of the things that we're where we sit is as we mentioned, kind of whether it's warranted or not, the kind of negative connotation around CVCs. So in our view, to make sure that we're all aligned in creating the greatest kind of capital appreciation for everyone on the cap table, founders included, that we find that the market is just more accepting of institutional lead. So we favor that, where possible.
Yeah. And then, are you managing the M&A activities at Nationwide? How acquisitive is Nationwide as a corporate? We're finding more and more that either M&A and CVC are sort of tucked under the same sort of eight-person team, or in some cases, no, corporate development is completely separate from the early stage investment strategy of the corporate venture arm. How does it work within Nationwide?
Yeah, so we're under the same umbrella. So Eric Ross manages both the venture team as well as the corporate development team and sits on top of both. I think in aggregate, maybe the team is 15 folks. Like I said, there's eight of us, or I guess seven of us on the VC team, if you include Eric, eight. And then I think there's maybe a handful or a little bit more on the M&A side. So I would say when we invest, we do not invest to acquire. That's not really the mandate that we're envisioning. So, and we're again forthright with founders, where it's if you're taking a check from Nationwide, don't assume that in 24 months we're going to turn around and buy you. But I will say, just kind of on a writ large basis, Nationwide has been quite acquisitive over the last 12 to 18 months. There's, a number of, publicly available press releases about some of the deal activity that's been done on Nationwide side on the acquisition side as well as the divestiture side. So Eric has certainly been busy across, the investments we're making as well as the acquisitions and divestitures that they're making.
So you got your corporate venture activity, you've got corp dev handling that. Are you also making LP commitments into VC funds?
We are. There's one gal on the team who's responsible for that. And I would say she's quite busy on that side as well. We or she will make anywhere from, 0 to 3 net new fund investments per year. And it's been a pretty successful, I would say, endeavor. We've met a bunch of great GPs. They've shared some best practices. They're sharing deal flow. They're sharing kind of they're bubbling up some of the same research that they're finding in very specific verticals that maybe we're not spending as much time in. Cyber being a perfect example, given how technical of a sector that really is. So she has found I think a lot of success investing in some of those more kind of vertically oriented funds that are still in the early stage. So let's call them, seed and A, as well as, even a click earlier that are more focused on, insurtech and fintech, which are kind of pre-seed seed, which are, doing the legwork, finding businesses that we're not seeing, bringing them to the forefront, telling us what they like, what they don't like, and, helping, essentially establish some of that really early stage pipeline that you can really only get if you're on the ground in, San Francisco, New York City, something like that.
As she looks at new relationships, is it primarily driven by enthusiasm for a new industry sector and finding managers in that particular industry sector? Is it driven by a geography, or is it more just a capability of the management team with a solid track record that are likely to produce quality deal flow?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It kind of touches on a little bit of everything. So she has done some investments that are specific to a geography as well as specific to a vertical. She's also done some that are just more oriented around helping us with pipeline. And then there's just some deals that, yeah, just a phenomenal GP that had a great track record in doing something that, appeared to be differentiated. And so it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And at the end of the day, she's done a really nice job aggregating, I think, a pool of very high quality managers that have, done, I think, a nice job on behalf of Nationwide.
Awesome. We've talked a little bit about trends in industry sectors. Let's talk a little bit about trends as it relates to corporate venture capital specifically. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing is some corporate venture groups are establishing an independent brand separate from sort of their corporate parent. Some are certainly going from passive roles at the Series C and Series D, where they were just providing sort of follow-on a financing of a lead financial VC to earlier in the financing food chain, operating like you are from seed to sort of A and B. And then some are even taking board roles now, or at least, consistently taking board observer roles. Those are some of the things we're seeing. Any other trends that you would highlight or anything else that you think is interesting as corporate venture sort of evolves to become, a major part of the overall sort of, venture capital investing ecosystem? I mean, it's been pretty amazing. What's your sense?
Yeah, no, I think 100% right. You're seeing an evolution of all these corporates kind of in some cases looking a little bit more institutional, and in other ways, I think, growing even stronger kind of in that strategic corporate kind of lens. But, one thing that I think is interesting that kind of highlights a little bit more of the, transition into more of an institutional look is that the multi-strategy look. Starting to see some of these corporates that began, to your point, in C through B that are now launching opportunity funds or growth vehicles that are sitting on that kind of B to pre-IPO that tend to be larger. And ultimately it's some of that same idea of, well, hey, we missed X, at the seed and the A. We really liked them, and they grew outside of this vehicle, and we can't chase it, or we can't chase it and get any type of meaningful ownership. So they've gone back to the well, convinced the mothership to grant them a larger vehicle to take ownership in those types of businesses. So I think you're almost seeing a mirror of what institutional was doing over the last 10 years is now kind of coming a little bit into the CVC world, because I think it does make sense, particularly in a strategic concept where most of these seed and Series A companies are years away from really being able to work with large enterprises. I mean, that's just kind of the reality of it. So it almost feels like it's a more natural fit to be investing at the BCD. But staying ahead of the business, I think, is also important, and staying at the forefront of technology to share those learnings. But then I think from a financial perspective, to be able to take advantage of those learnings as they've actually matured into a real business, and one that's going to continue to grow quite large or even IPO, to take advantage of kind of that financial upside of kind of the earned financial upside of the work that you've done on the early side to understand where it's going and knowing the companies and knowing the management teams. So I think that's been an interesting kind of evolution of CVC that mirrors a little bit more of the look of institutional, but I think really does make a lot of sense. If you've been working in the early stage for years and kind of developed that muscle tissue.
Do you think the industry is, well, you've been around for 10 years now. Do you think the new entrants into the market are using it as a visibility campaign to interesting innovation that may be relevant to their business units? How do you think the new entrants that have come in over the last 5 years on the corporate venture side? Because I think GCV, maybe it was GCV or somebody else that said, but it's like 30 to 40% of all venture-backed deals are now coming from corporate investment. I mean, that's a pretty sizable amount of the
Hmm.
venture ecosystem. So some of that is sort of, to your point, maybe visibility to innovation, and then maybe taking advantage of the financial return opportunity at the early stage. Is that kind of how you view it? What would you add or edit with regard to what I just said?
It's a great question. I think what's driving some of that growth, I think ultimately certainly is the R&D piece, the innovation piece. And there's just the reality that, on a kind of the pre-COVID right into COVID basis, the returns were eye-popping. I mean, there was a reason why there was an absolute flood of, institutional endowment and otherwise LP capital into the space. Everyone was kind of chasing that alpha. So, uh, the corporates just tend to move a little bit slower. You've got other, kind of approvals to kind of go through. So it may still be somewhat reflexive on that, that there is this opportunity to create, a large financial return out of a very small group of people and a relatively small check comparable to, the revenue and the incomes of these large enterprises. But I do think there is something special about having boots on the ground, particularly in large geographies, that the enterprise certainly wouldn't typically be working in. So, whether it's a JetBlue Ventures in the Valley or Goodyear or Xerox or whatever the case may be, having people in a different geo who are seeing and hearing different things and are just ultimately involved in a different environment writ large, I think are going to just bring back a different type of learning versus, an R&D lab that's sitting in, you know, Atlanta, Georgia, whatever the case may be for Coca-Cola, right? So I think there's something special to that, and maybe the organizations are catching on to that. I mean, it also could just be, a a bit of a FOMO situation. If your competitor or competitors are all doing it, then you probably feel like you have to do it too. And as it grows, that just may be a natural symptom of it.
I think that's certainly part of it for sure. I think some of the new entrants from, I'd say 50% of the calls that I've done recently or other interviews of new entrants into the corporate venture space, a lot of discussion about defense tech, robotics, humanoids. Those areas relevant to Nationwide, or are those a little bit separate from sort of the industry sectors that you're targeting?
Sure. So from a defense perspective, definitely a little far afield. That being said, I have started to see, satellite insurance companies, because I mean, obviously as, Starlink is going up and many of these other kind of space-oriented companies, which, I think defense and space are somewhat interconnected. But there's, new insurance that is popping up associated with these new technologies, which I think, poses a really interesting question, whether it's autonomous vehicles or it's humanoids or it's satellites or it's AI models and in coding, who owns the risk at the end of the day, right? And then where's the risk transfer occurring from an insurance perspective? It's hard to say who actually owns the risk. Is it the model writer? Is it the person who told the humanoid to do X, Y, Z? Is it the maker of the hardware because it was faulty and it wasn't able to grip the pot of coffee, which then fell and burnt someone? The questions kind of unravel over time. And it's a really interesting question from an insurance perspective. These are the things of the future, but we do need to think about the risks associated with them and who's ultimately, going to bear that risk. So I think it's really interesting from an insurance perspective to think about these new innovations.
Yeah, I do too. That is interesting. Okay, we made it, Josh. We made it to the rapid fire portion of the program.
Okay.
I got last couple questions for you. Favorite podcast or industry publication? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about Acquired and All In, and obviously doom scrolling LinkedIn. I could, I could do it for hours, and there is a lot of interesting stuff on there. You got to be careful about how much time I spend on it. But favorite podcast or industry publication?
So, from a pure entertainment perspective, I do like All In. It's a weekly listen of mine, but I will say, and it's also a very popular one that most folks probably have heard of, but if they hadn't, it's called Founders by David Senra, where he does, I'd call it short form versus long form podcast. So let's call it like hour to an hour and a half, where he's covering, entrepreneurs that have done something successfully for at least 15 plus years. So they're not flashes in the pan, and it's across, it's every industry you can imagine, whether it's Coco Chanel, whether it's JP Morgan, whether it's Elon Musk. It's both new, recent, as well as old. And I think all of the stories are very interesting, but it's something you can learn from, and then there's commonalities across all of the various founding stories, and essentially the characters that drive them, and what drives them, what motivates them, and drives them ultimately, or what earns them the success at the end of the day. I think it's just always amazing to me to hear those stories, how these folks have changed the world, the products they've created, and ultimately how the similarities may still exist, whether, it's Enzo Ferrari from 80 years ago or it's Elon Musk who's taking us to Mars tomorrow. I think it's for someone who's in the technology space, whether you're a venture capitalist or you're a founder yourself, I think it's a great podcast to listen to. It's very inspiring.
Founder sounds great. Okay, and then I'll finish with a personal question. You may know that I had a thought leadership project that I did as part of my time in the Kauffman Fellows program. And I ended up writing a book on strategic planning for life, and Kauffman was kind enough to distribute it out at one of their summits. And part of the book basically talks about how we launch our days, how the morning routine that sort of allows you to bring your A game to not only sort of life, but also the work that you do. I guess your mornings are a little chaotic these days with a new baby at home. But anything you do in particular to sort of kickstart your day to bring your sort of A game to life and to work?
Yeah, well, there's nothing quite like chasing a toddler at 7:30 in the morning at full speed, trying to get their diaper changed to get the synapses firing. But realistically, outside of that, I really do enjoy taking, whether it's a 10 or 15 minute shower, just a hot shower, kind of gets the brain moving, get thinking. It's a quiet space. You can kind of, close your eyes and just kind of meditate almost on the day and what's to come, the meetings that are, forthcoming, the deliverables that might be on your table, or, maybe some of the deep dives that you're doing thematically on, whether it's a new technology or a vertical. I find it's a cleansing exercise that's a little bit energizing as well because it gives you the clarity on, kind of what you want to do and how you're going to do it. So one of my favorite parts of the day for sure.
Thanks for sharing that. I was reading some stuff on longevity about the power of not only hot showers but saunas, and how this has got to be part of a routine. So I'm currently trying to lobby with my wife about buying a sauna for our home. We'll see if I'm successful. On behalf of the team at Sarah Cap Impact Venture Capital and the Coffin Fellows, thanks to Josh Belicki for spending a little bit of time with us.
Jack, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for the time.
That's a wrap.